When Julia arrived in the unforgiving Montana mountains, she thought she was taking a desperate job to cook for a rugged, isolated lumberjack. The cabin was miles from civilization, the winters were lethal, and the man was as cold as the ice on the windows. She was just an employee, trading biscuits and stews for a roof over her head. At least, that's what she believed, until his feral, silent little girl tugged her apron and whispered a secret that changed everything. The year was 1883, and the soot-choked skies of St. Louis were closing in on Julia Jenkins. Julia was 24, practical, and completely destitute. When her father, a modest dry goods merchant, succumbed to a sudden bout of consumption, he left behind nothing but a ledger dripping in red ink. The debt was held by a ruthless local creditor named Josiah Flint, a man who made it abundantly clear that if Julia could not pay with cash, she would pay with her freedom, forced into an indentured marriage to a man 3 times her age. Desperation breeds audacity. On a rainy Tuesday, Julia spent her last 3 pennies on a copy of the Missouri Gazette. Buried in the back pages, nestled between advertisements for patent medicines and cattle auctions, was a short, rigidly worded, classified, wanted, capable woman to serve as cook and housekeeper for a remote mountain holding in the Bitterroot Range. Must withstand harsh winters and extreme isolation. No families, no frail constitutions. Board, room, and a generous monthly wage provided. Inquire by post. W. Caldwell. Bear Creek, Montana Territory. It was a lifeline woven from thorns. Julia didn't know the first thing about the frontier, but she knew how to bake, how to scrub a floor until it bled splinters, and most importantly, how to run. She sent a letter that afternoon, vastly exaggerating her experience as a domestic servant, and prayed. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived containing a one-way train ticket to Helena, a stagecoach voucher, and a single, scrawled note. Be on the noon stage. I do not wait. The journey west was a grueling trial of dust, bruised bones, and endless, terrifying expanses of prairie that eventually thrust upward into jagged, snow-capped peaks. When the stagecoach finally deposited Julia in the muddy, lawless stain of a town called Bear Creek, her tailored city dress was ruined, her hands were blistered from gripping the window frame, and her nerves were frayed to snapping. She stood on the boardwalk, a solitary carpetbag at her feet, as the stagecoach rattled away. The town was little more than a collection of rough-hewn timber saloons, a general store, and a livery. You the cook? The voice was like 2 river stones grinding together. Julia spun around. Standing behind her was a man who looked as though the mountain itself had birthed him. Wyatt Caldwell was a giant of a man, clad in worn buckskin and a heavy wool coat. His shoulders were impossibly broad, blocking out the afternoon sun. A thick, dark beard obscured his jaw, but his eyes, a striking, piercing shade of pale blue, were entirely visible, and they were staring at her with blatant disapproval. I am Julia Jenkins, she said, forcing her chin up. Mr. Caldwell, I presume? Wyatt didn't offer a hand. He looked her up and down, taking in her pale complexion, her delicate hands, and the trembling she couldn't quite hide. I wrote to the agency for a sturdy widow, a woman who knows how to survive a freeze. You look like a stiff wind would break you in half. I assure you, Mr. Caldwell, I am stronger than I look, Julia shot back, her fear momentarily eclipsed by indignation. I have the ticket you sent. I am here to cook and clean. If you want to waste the money you spent bringing me out here, you can buy my passage back. Otherwise, show me to the wagon. A muscle feathered in Wyatt's jaw. For a long, agonizing moment, the mountain man simply stared at her. Then he turned on his heel. Wagons at the livery. Keep up. The ride up into the Bitterroots took 4 bone-rattling hours. The makeshift road was barely a trail, winding through towering pines and precarious cliff edges. Julia clung to the wooden bench, watching civilization vanish behind them. She had expected to be taken to a logging camp, a bustling settlement of rough men needing hearty meals. Instead, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow, the wagon pulled into a clearing. There were no bunkhouses, there was no camp. There was only a single, sturdy log cabin with smoke curling from a stone chimney, a massive barn, and a backdrop of impenetrable wilderness. A large wolfhound mix bounded off the porch, barking furiously until Wyatt silenced him with a low whistle. Julia froze, her hands gripping her carpetbag. "Where are the men?" she asked, her voice faltering. "Where is the crew?" Wyatt unhitched the draft horses with practiced, heavy movements. He didn't even look at her as he answered. "There is no crew, Miss Jenkins. It's just me." Panic flared hot and bright in Julia's chest. She had traveled 2,000 miles to be utterly alone in the wilderness with a stranger who looked capable of snapping her neck with one hand. "Just you?" Julia echoed, her voice rising in pitch. Before Wyatt could answer, the heavy wooden door of the cabin creaked open. Standing in the threshold, wrapped in a tattered wool blanket, was a tiny, ghostly figure. It was a little girl, no older than 6, with a mess of tangled blonde curls and wide, hollow eyes that stared right through Julia. "Me," Wyatt corrected gruffly, lifting a heavy sack of flour onto his shoulder. "And her. Get inside before you freeze, Miss Jenkins. I expect supper by 8. Julia quickly learned that surviving the Bitterroots was not merely about avoiding the cold. It was about navigating the crushing silence. The first week was a brutal baptism by fire and ice. Julia woke before dawn every day, her breath pluming in the freezing cabin air, to stoke the hearth, haul water from the half-frozen creek, and prepare mountains of flapjacks, thick-cut bacon, and black coffee. Wyatt was a ghost in his own home. He left before the sun rose to tend to his livestock, trap in the deep woods, and mend fences, returning only when the sky was bruised with twilight. He spoke entirely in grunts, single syllables, and nods. He was a man hollowed out by grief, though Julia didn't yet know the shape of it. But it was the little girl, Lily, who truly shattered Julia's heart. Lily was a feral creature of the shadows. She refused to wear shoes, preferring to silently dart around the cabin in thick woolen socks. She communicated only through stares and the occasional frantic tug on Wyatt's sleeve. "Why doesn't she speak?" Julia asked one evening, scrubbing an iron skillet with coarse sand as Wyatt sat by the fire, oiling his rifle. Wyatt paused. The silence stretched so long Julia thought he was going to ignore her. "She hasn't spoken a word in 2 years, Wyatt said, his voice carrying a rough, torn edge. "Not since the blizzard. Not since her mother." He didn't elaborate, and the dark, warning look in his blue eyes told Julia that pressing the matter would be a dangerous mistake. Determined to earn her keep and perhaps bring a shred of warmth to this frozen purgatory, Julia shifted her focus to the child. She didn't push Lily to talk. Instead, she started leaving small offerings. A warm honey biscuit left on the edge of the table, a doll meticulously crafted from corn husks and scrap cotton seated quietly on Lily's pillow. Slowly, the feral child began to emerge from the woodwork. Lily would sit by the hearth while Julia kneaded dough, her wide blue eyes tracking the woman's every movement. Julia began to hum soft St. Louis parlor songs, letting the melodies fill the oppressive silence of the cabin. Eventually, Lily began to inch closer, until one afternoon, while Julia was peeling potatoes, she felt a small, warm weight lean against her thigh. Lily was resting her head on Julia's apron, her thumb in her mouth, her eyes heavy with sleep. Julia's breath hitched. She tentatively rested a flour-dusted hand on the little girl's head, stroking her tangled blonde curls. When she looked up, she found Wyatt standing in the doorway. He was shirtless, sweat glistening on the hard, scarred plains of his chest despite the bitter cold outside, an axe resting easily in his large grip. The sight of him, raw, powerful, and undeniably masculine, made a treacherous flush rise up Julia's neck. But it was the look on his face that caught her off guard. His expression wasn't cold. It was one of profound, aching vulnerability, mixed with a hunger he quickly masked by dropping his gaze. "Wood's chopped," he muttered, turning swiftly and disappearing back into the snow. The undeniable tension between them began to simmer, a dangerous undercurrent to their daily routine. But the isolation of the mountain bred paranoia as much as it bred intimacy. In her second month, while deep cleaning the pantry shelves, Julia discovered a heavy, iron-bound trunk hidden beneath a stack of burlap grain sacks. It was locked with a heavy brass padlock, but the hinges were loose. As she tried to shove it back into place, a piece of folded parchment slipped out from the crack. Julia shouldn't have read it, but the frontier had made her nosy. It was a letter, dated 3 years prior, written in elegant, looping cursive. "Wyatt, if you don't give him the land, he will take it in blood. Thomas knows what you did. He knows the truth about Mary's sickness. You have to leave before he comes for Lily, too." The letter was unsigned. A chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter seeped into Julia's bones. Thomas? What truth about Mary? Before she could process the warning, the cabin door slammed open. Wyatt stood there, a blizzard howling behind him, carrying a bleeding, lifeless-looking calf in his arms. "Clear the table," he roared, kicking the door shut. The mystery of the trunk was instantly forgotten. For the next 3 hours, Julia and Wyatt worked shoulder to shoulder, hands slick with blood and warm water, fighting to stitch a massive wolf bite on the calf's flank. The storm outside escalated into a deafening roar, rattling the heavy log walls and threatening to rip the roof off. When it was over, the calf was breathing steadily by the hearth. Wyatt collapsed into a wooden chair, his head in his hands, utterly spent. Julia, exhausted and trembling, brought him a tin cup of whiskey. As he took the cup, his large, calloused fingers brushed against hers. He didn't pull away. Wyatt looked up at her, the flickering firelight casting deep shadows across his rugged face. The distance between them had completely vanished. He reached up, his rough thumb tracing the line of her jaw, wiping away a smear of soot. His touch was impossibly gentle for a man of his size. "You shouldn't be here, Julia," he whispered, his voice dark and thick. "This mountain, it ruins soft things." Julia leaned imperceptibly into his touch, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I'm not as soft as you think, Wyatt." For a second, she thought he was going to pull her into his lap and kiss her. The space between their lips was agonizingly small. But a sudden, sharp crack of thunder shattered the moment. Wyatt pulled back as if burned, his mask of indifference slamming back into place, leaving Julia breathless and aching with a confusion she couldn't name. Spring arrived in the Bitterroots not with a gentle thaw, but with a violent rush of melting ice, roaring creeks, and a desperate need for supplies. Julia and Wyatt's relationship had settled into a tense, agonizing dance. She knew she was falling in love with the gruff mountain man, and she loved little Lily as if she had birthed her herself. But Wyatt kept her at arm's length, retreating to his walls whenever the undeniable spark between them flared too bright. Julia reminded herself constantly, "You are the hired help, nothing more." With the roads finally passable, Wyatt hitched the wagon. They needed flour, sugar, ammunition, and seeds from Bear Creek. It was to be Julia's first trip back to civilization in 3 months. The town of Bear Creek was bustling with the frantic energy of spring. Loggers, cattlemen, and miners choked the muddy streets. Wyatt left Julia at the mercantile with a leather coin purse and instructions to buy whatever she saw fit for the kitchen, while he went to the assayer's office. Julia was inspecting bolts of calico fabric when a shadow fell over her. Well. Caldwell actually found himself a stray willing to freeze to death on that God-forsaken ridge. Julia turned to see a sharply dressed man in a tailored broadcloth suit and a silk vest. He had a handsome face, ruined by eyes that were as flat and cold as a serpent's. He tipped his bowler hat mockingly. "I am Thomas Gable," the man purred, stepping too close. Julia backed into the counter. "I own most of the cattle in this valley, and I'll own Caldwell's timber soon enough." Julia felt a jolt of recognition. "Thomas," the man from the hidden letter. "Mr. Caldwell's business is his own, sir," Julia said coldly, trying to step around him. Gable blocked her path, his grip suddenly closing like a vice around her upper arm. "Is it? Did he tell you about his business with his late wife, Mary? Did he tell you how she begged to come down off that mountain when the fever took her, but his stubborn, possessive pride kept her up there until her lungs filled with blood?" Gable leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive cigars and sour whiskey. "He killed her, girl. Just like he'll kill you if you don't pack your bags and run. Take your hands off her." The voice boomed through the mercantile like a cannon shot. Wyatt stood in the doorway. He didn't look like the quiet, grieving widower Julia knew. He looked like the apex predator of the Bitterroots. Before Gable could even release his grip, Wyatt crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Gable by the lapels of his expensive suit, hoisted the wealthy baron completely off his feet, and hurled him backward. Gable crashed through a display of stacked canned peaches, wood splintering and tin clattering wildly across the floorboards. "If you ever speak to her, if you ever look at her again," Wyatt snarled, drawing his heavy Colt revolver and pointing it squarely at Gable's chest, "I won't bother digging a hole. I'll leave you for the scavengers." The entire store was dead silent. Julia was trembling violently. Wyatt holstered his gun, grabbed Julia's hand, and dragged her out to the wagon. The ride up the mountain was terrifyingly silent. The violence she had witnessed terrified her, but what terrified her more were Gable's words. He killed her. When they finally reached the cabin, night had fallen. Wyatt unhitched the horses in the dark, refusing to speak. Julia walked up the steps to the porch and collapsed onto the wooden rocking chair, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush, replaced by quiet, devastating tears. She had run from a monster in St. Louis only to fall in love with a man who might be hiding a darkness she couldn't comprehend. She was a fool, a hired cook playing house. Suddenly, the front door creaked open. Little Lily padded out onto the porch in her nightgown. She saw Julia crying and stopped. Slowly, the little girl walked over and climbed into Julia's lap. She reached up with tiny, warm fingers and wiped a tear from Julia's cheek. Julia choked on a sob, wrapping her arms around the child. "Oh, Lily," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't think I belong here. I think I'm going to have to leave. I'm just the cook, sweet girl. I'm just an employee." Lily shook her head vehemently. Her little hands gripped the fabric of Julia's dress. Then, for the first time in 2 years, the child parted her lips. Her voice was raspy, unused, and tiny as a mouse, but the words were clear as crystal in the crisp mountain air. "You can't leave," Lily whispered. "I picked you to be my mommy." Julia froze, her breath catching in her throat. The world seemed to stop spinning. What did you say, baby?" A heavy boot stepped onto the porch, creaking the wood. Wyatt stepped out of the shadows. He had heard everything. His broad shoulders slumped, and he took his hat off, twisting the brim in his large hands. The dangerous predator from the mercantile was gone, replaced by a man completely stripped of his armor. "She's telling the truth," Wyatt said, his voice thick with emotion. Julia stared at him, bewildered. "What do you mean? You placed the ad for a cook?" Wyatt shook his head slowly, stepping closer to them. "I didn't place any ad, Julia. I can't read or write more than my own name. I went to Mrs. Higgins, the postmistress in town. I told her I was failing, that Lily was fading away without a mother, and I didn't know how to save her. Mrs. Higgins had a catalog from a matrimonial agency back east. She laid the photographs out on the table." Wyatt knelt down in front of the rocking chair, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Julia's tear-stained face. He reached out, his massive hand gently enveloping both of Julia's small hands where they rested on Lily's back. "I didn't pick you to come here and cook my meals, Julia," Wyatt confessed, his voice dropping to a rough, vulnerable whisper. "Lily pointed to your picture, and I spent every last dime I had to my name to bring you here, because my daughter chose you to save us both." The silence on the porch was heavier than the winter snows that had trapped them for months. Julia sat paralyzed in the wooden rocking chair, her arms still wrapped protectively around little Lily. Wyatt Caldwell, the rugged, terrifying mountain man who had seemed as impenetrable as the granite peaks surrounding them, remained on his knees. His confession hung in the frigid air, raw and exposed. "My daughter chose you to save us both." Julia stared down at the photograph Wyatt had pulled from his heavy wool coat. It was her, the portrait she had taken in St. Louis 3 years ago, before her father's death, before the ruin, before Josiah Flint had threatened to turn her into collateral. "You bought a bride?" Julia's voice was a fragile whisper, trembling with a mixture of betrayal and profound awe. "All this time, you let me scrub your floors and bake your bread, thinking I was just a desperate hired hand?" Wyatt looked down at his calloused hands. "I didn't know how to tell you, Julia. When you stepped off that stagecoach, you looked so terrified. You looked like a strong wind would scatter you to the pines. If I had told you the truth, that I was a broken man looking for a mother for a feral child, you would have gotten right back on that coach. I figured if you learned to survive the mountain first, maybe you could learn to stomach me." Lily shifted in Julia's lap, her small hands reaching up to cup Julia's face. "Don't be mad at Papa," the little girl rasped, her unused voice still finding its footing. "I pointed at your picture. You had kind eyes." Tears spilled hotly down Julia's cheeks, freezing almost instantly in the mountain air. The anger she expected to feel simply wasn't there. Instead, there was a profound, aching relief. She hadn't been hired. She had been chosen. "Wyatt," Julia said, her voice steadying. "Stand up." The giant of a man slowly rose to his feet, towering over her, yet looking entirely at her mercy. "What Thomas Gable said in the mercantile today," Julia began, her tone hardening. She needed the shadows cleared. All of them. "He said you killed your wife. He said Mary begged to leave the mountain, and your pride kept her here until her lungs filled with blood. If I am to be a mother to this child, if I am to stay in this cabin, I need the truth. Right now." A dark, agonizing pain flashed across Wyatt's piercing blue eyes. He turned away, leaning his heavy forearms against the wooden porch railing, staring out into the pitch-black wilderness. "Mary had consumption," Wyatt said, his voice thick with old grief. "She was sick long before we left the East. The doctors told me she had 6 months. They said the damp city air was drowning her. I brought her up here to the Bitterroots because the high, dry altitude was supposed to clear her lungs. And it did. It gave us 4 more years. It gave us Lily." He turned back to face Julia, the moonlight casting harsh angles across his scarred face. But the sickness came back. By the end, she was too weak to travel. Moving her down the mountain in the dead of winter would have killed her in hours. Thomas Gable knows this. But Gable works for William Andrews Clark, the copper baron over in Butte. They found out a railroad spur is planned to cut right through this ridge. Gable wants my timber, and he wants my land. He started spreading rumors in Bear Creek that I held Mary hostage up here, hoping the law would run me out or hang me. Wyatt walked back over to Julia, kneeling once more. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his large frame enveloped her. "I have never raised a hand in anger to a woman, Julia. I loved Mary, and I buried her under the old pine out back. But I was dying up here without her. Lily was dying. When you came, you brought the sun back into this cabin." Julia looked at the man before her. She saw past the grime, the rough buckskin, and the terrifying reputation. She saw a father who had spent his last dime to save his daughter. Slowly, Julia reached out. Her delicate, flour-dusted fingers traced the rough line of Wyatt's jaw, resting against the thick scruff of his beard. Wyatt's breath hitched, his eyes fluttering shut at her touch. "I ran from a monster in St. Louis," Julia whispered fiercely. "A man who wanted to own me to settle a ledger. I won't run from a man who wants me because his daughter needed a mother." Wyatt opened his eyes, a blazing, reverent hunger burning in the pale blue depths. He leaned forward, closing the final inch between them, and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, polite kiss. It was a claiming. It tasted of whiskey, cold mountain air, and desperate salvation. Julia kissed him back with a fierce, answering heat, her hands tangling in his dark hair as Lily rested quietly against her chest. For the next 2 weeks, the cabin transformed. The crushing, oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the sound of Lily's quiet laughter and Wyatt's deep, rumbling voice. Julia was no longer the hired help. She was the heart of the home. Wyatt looked at her not with the cold indifference of an employer, but with the possessive, adoring gaze of a husband. But the mountain was unforgiving, and the shadow of Thomas Gable was growing longer. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the incident at the mercantile. Wyatt was out in the barn shoeing a draft horse, and Julia was inside, teaching Lily how to read from a battered copy of McGuffey's primer. The wolfhound, Tracker, suddenly bolted out from under the porch, his hackles raised, barking viciously toward the winding trail that led down the mountain. Julia moved to the window, pulling back the gingham curtain. Her stomach plummeted. Riding up the narrow switchback were 5 men on horseback. At the front was Thomas Gable, wearing a heavy duster over his tailored suit. Beside him was a man Julia recognized from her brief time in town, Deputy Marshal Elias Thorne, a notoriously corrupt lawman on William Andrews Clark's payroll. The other 3 men were hardened, rough-looking mercenaries carrying repeating rifles. "Lily," Julia said, her voice eerily calm despite the terror seizing her chest. "Go to the root cellar. Right now. Do not make a sound until I come for you." Lily's eyes widened, but the mountain had taught her obedience in the face of danger. She nodded, scurrying toward the heavy trapdoor in the pantry floor. Julia grabbed Wyatt's spare Winchester rifle from above the mantel. She didn't know how to shoot it well, but she knew how to cock the lever. Outside, Wyatt had already stepped out of the barn. He held an axe in his right hand, his stance wide and lethal. The riders pulled into the clearing, their horses snorting in the crisp air. Gable sneered down at Wyatt, a rolled piece of parchment in his gloved hand. "Morning, Caldwell," Gable called out, his voice dripping with venom. "Brought the deputy marshal with me today. Seems there's been a discrepancy with your land claim." Wyatt didn't move. "My claim was filed in Helena 5 years ago, Gable. Paid in full. Now get off my property before I introduce you to the business end of a 12-gauge. Deputy Marshal Elias stepped his horse forward, resting a hand on his holstered sidearm. "Now, Wyatt, no need for bloodshed. We have a sworn affidavit from a judge in St. Louis. Seems your mail-order bride is a fugitive, a Miss Julia Jenkins." Julia, standing just inside the cracked cabin door, stopped breathing. "St. Louis." Gable unfurled the parchment, his smile cruel and triumphant. "Josiah Flint is a very persistent man, Julia," Gable shouted toward the cabin, knowing she was listening. "He contacted the Pinkertons when you skipped town on your debts. They tracked your stagecoach voucher. The law says you belong to Flint, girl. You're stolen property." Gable turned back to Wyatt. "The deputy here has a warrant for her arrest, but I'm a reasonable man. Sign the deed to this ridge over to the Anaconda Copper Company, and we'll ride away. I'll even accidentally drop the warrant in the creek. You keep the girl, I get the timber. Refuse, and the deputy takes her back to Missouri in irons." Wyatt's grip on the axe handle tightened until his knuckles turned bone white. The choice was agonizingly clear. Give up the land he had bled for, the grave of his first wife, and his only livelihood, or lose the woman who had just brought his soul back to life. "You lay one hand on her," Wyatt growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, primal rage, "and I'll cut you into pieces so small the buzzards will choke." "Have it your way," Gable spat. He snapped his fingers. "Take the house. Burn the barn." Chaos erupted. The 3 mercenaries dismounted, raising their rifles. Wyatt lunged. He threw the heavy wood axe with terrifying precision. The blade buried itself deep into the chest of the closest mercenary, throwing the man backward into the dirt. Before the others could track him, Wyatt drew his Colt revolver and fired, clipping Elias in the shoulder. The lawman screamed, his horse rearing wildly. But there were too many of them. A bullet splintered the wooden post inches from Wyatt's head. Another mercenary, a scarred brute with a shotgun, flanked the barn, aiming squarely at Wyatt's exposed back. Bang! The booming crack of a Winchester echoed across the ridge. The brute with the shotgun dropped his weapon, screaming as he clutched his shattered knee. Wyatt spun around. Julia was standing on the porch, the Winchester rifle pressed firmly against her shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel. Her eyes were wide, terrified, but completely resolute. "Get in the house, Wyatt!" she screamed, jacking the lever of the rifle and sending another round into the dirt near Gable's horse. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He scrambled up the porch steps, grabbed Julia by the waist, and practically threw them both through the heavy oak door, slamming it shut and dropping the massive iron bar into place just as a hail of bullets tore through the front windows, shattering glass and showering the room in lethal splinters. They scrambled behind the heavy oak dining table as bullets thudded rhythmically against the thick log walls. Tracker the wolfhound was barking furiously by the back door. Wyatt checked the cylinder of his Colt. 3 rounds left. He looked over at Julia, who was shaking violently, the rifle clutched in her hands. "You shot him," Wyatt said, a mixture of disbelief and fierce pride in his eyes. "I was aiming for his chest," Julia choked out, wiping a streak of dust from her face. "I'm a terrible shot." "You did perfect," Wyatt whispered, pressing a hard, desperate kiss to her forehead. "Where's Lily?" "Root cellar." Wyatt nodded. The gunfire outside suddenly ceased. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. "Caldwell!" Gable's voice rang out from the tree line. "You're holed up good, I'll give you that. But I don't need to shoot you out. I just need to smoke you out." A faint orange glow began to flicker through the shattered windows. The smell of kerosene and burning pine immediately assaulted their senses. Gable's men had set the front porch on fire. "Wyatt, the house will burn down around us," Julia panicked, coughing as the smoke began to seep under the floorboards. "The logs are thick. It'll take time," Wyatt said, his mind racing, calculating their survival. "There's an old trapping tunnel I dug under the floorboards in the bedroom. It leads out past the tree line. We can get out." "But they'll take the land," Julia cried. "They'll take everything you built." Wyatt reached out, gripping her face in his large, soot-stained hands. "The land doesn't matter, Julia. You matter. Lily matters. A man's home isn't the dirt he stands on. It's the people he bleeds for. Let it burn." He grabbed her hand, and together they crawled low under the smoke toward the pantry to retrieve their daughter, fully aware that if Gable caught them fleeing into the woods, the mountain would become their grave. The smoke was a living, suffocating thing. It billowed beneath the floorboards, thick and gray, carrying the acrid stench of burning pine pitch and kerosene. Julia scrambled on her hands and knees across the kitchen, coughing violently as the air grew heavy and dark. Wyatt was right behind her, his massive frame navigating the tight space with terrifying speed. He yanked open the pantry door, grabbing the heavy iron ring of the root cellar trap door, and heaved it upward. Below, in the cool, damp earth, little Lily sat curled beside a barrel of salted pork, her hands pressed tightly over her ears. Her eyes were wide with terror, reflecting the orange glow that was beginning to lick at the edges of the shattered windows above. "Come here, little bird," Wyatt rumbled, reaching down. He hauled the child up effortlessly, tucking her against his broad chest. He turned to Julia, his eyes watering from the smoke but burning with a fierce, unwavering light. "The bedroom. Keep low." Bullets continued to pepper the exterior logs, a relentless drumming of lead. They crawled into the bedroom. The heat was becoming unbearable. The front porch had completely caught, and the flames were spreading to the roof. Wyatt shoved the heavy, iron-framed bed aside, revealing 3 loose floorboards. He kicked them up, exposing a dark, narrow chute carved into the frozen earth. "It drops down about 4 feet, then levels out toward the tree line," Wyatt instructed, his voice tight. He handed Julia the Winchester rifle. "You go first. Take Lily. I'll cover the rear." Julia didn't argue. The city girl who had once fainted at the sight of a carriage accident in St. Louis was gone, burned away by the harsh reality of the Bitterroots. She slipped into the dark hole, reaching up to take Lily from Wyatt. The tunnel was terrifyingly cramped, smelling of wet dirt, roots, and decay. Julia placed Lily in front of her and began to crawl. Above them, the cabin groaned. The immense heat was warping the massive timbers. They crawled for what felt like an eternity, the sound of the crackling fire growing muffled, replaced by the deafening thud of Julia's own heartbeat. Finally, the tunnel sloped upward, terminating in a thick patch of thorny blackberry bushes at the edge of the forest. Julia pushed through the brush, gasping as the freezing, crisp mountain air hit her lungs. She pulled Lily out, wrapping her arms around the trembling child. A moment later, Wyatt emerged, soot-stained and breathing hard, his heavy Colt revolver drawn. They stood in the shadows of the towering pines, watching the destruction of their world. The cabin, the place where Julia had learned to bake, where she had found a family, where she had fallen in love, was a towering inferno. The flames clawed at the night sky, sending a shower of glowing embers swirling into the snow like fireflies. Thomas Gable stood in the clearing, shielded by the heat, his face twisted in a mask of cruel triumph. The mercenary with the shattered knee was groaning by the wagon, while the remaining uninjured hired gun kept his rifle trained on the front door, waiting for them to burn. Deputy Elias was nowhere to be seen, likely having spurred his horse back to Bear Creek the moment he caught lead in his shoulder. "They ain't screaming, boss," the mercenary shouted over the roar of the fire. "Shouldn't they be screaming?" Gable's triumphant smile faltered. He stared at the roaring flames, realization suddenly dawning on his aristocratic features. "The chimney smoke," Gable snapped. "There's no smoke coming from the chimney. They're not in there. Spread out. They ran into the woods." In the tree line, Wyatt's jaw hardened. He turned to Julia, his large hands gripping her shoulders. "A mile up this ridge, there's an old limestone overhang, a trapper's cave. Take Tracker and Lily. Hide there. Do not make a sound, and do not come out until the sun is high." "Wyatt, no," Julia whispered, gripping his buckskin coat. "There are 2 of them left, and they have repeating rifles. Come with us." Wyatt shook his head, a dark, primal shadow falling over his features. "If I run with you, they'll track our footprints in the snow. They'll find you. I have to break their trail." He reached up, tracing her soot-stained cheek. "I spent my whole life building a home out of wood and mud, Julia. Took me until today to realize my home is standing right in front of me. I will come back to you." Before Julia could protest, Wyatt melted into the darkness of the forest, moving with absolute, terrifying silence. Julia swallowed her sob. She grabbed Lily's hand, whistled softly for the wolfhound, and began the grueling trek up the mountain. The snow was deep, biting through her leather boots, but adrenaline pushed her forward. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot. Down in the valley, the hunt began. The mercenary, a seasoned tracker named a man named Miller, moved cautiously through the pines. He held his lantern high, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. He found the crushed blackberry bushes. "Over here!" Miller yelled back toward the clearing. "Found their rat hole!" Miller stepped into the thicket, lowering his lantern to examine the footprints. He didn't see the massive shadow drop from the branches of the ancient pine above him until it was too late. Wyatt landed silently behind the man. One massive hand clamped over Miller's mouth, extinguishing his shout, while Wyatt's other hand brought the heavy pommel of his hunting knife down on the back of the man's skull. Miller crumpled into the snow without a sound. Wyatt took the man's rifle, checked the chamber, and vanished back into the brush. Half a mile up the ridge, Julia's lungs were burning. Lily was exhausted, her little legs dragging. They reached the limestone overhang, a shallow, dark cave sheltered from the wind. Julia pushed Lily to the very back, wrapping the child in her own wool coat, leaving herself freezing in her torn dress. Tracker stood at the mouth of the cave, emitting a low, continuous growl. Footsteps crunched in the snow. Slow, deliberate. Julia raised the Winchester, her finger hovering over the trigger. Thomas Gable stepped into the moonlight, filtering through the trees. His expensive duster was singed, and he held a silver-plated revolver in his hand. He had followed the dog's tracks. "Well, well," Gable panted, a cruel smirk spreading across his face as he leveled his gun at Julia. "The Missouri runaway. I have to admit, you've got grit, girl. But Wyatt is dead. My man caught him by the creek. It's just you, me, and the brat now." Julia's heart stopped. Wyatt is dead. The world tilted on its axis. A profound, hollow agony ripped through her chest, so violent it stole her breath. But looking at the monster standing before her, looking at Lily trembling in the shadows, the agony instantly crystallized into pure, unadulterated rage. Julia stood up, stepping in front of the cave entrance. She didn't lower the rifle. "You're lying," Julia said, her voice eerily calm, resonating with the freezing stillness of the mountain. "Wyatt Caldwell is twice the man you'll ever be, and if he's dead, then I have nothing left to lose." Gable laughed, cocking the hammer of his revolver. "You're going to shoot me, Cook? You're shaking like a leaf." "I told you once, mister." "Gable," Julia said, her grip tightening on the woodstock. "I am a terrible shot, which means I probably won't hit your heart. I'll hit your stomach, and up here, it will take you 3 agonizing days to die of the infection." Gable's smile vanished. "Put the gun down, you stupid bee." Click. The unmistakable sound of a rifle hammer locking back echoed through the trees directly behind Gable. "Drop it, Thomas." Gable froze. Julia gasped. Wyatt stepped out from the shadows of a massive boulder, holding Miller's repeating rifle. He was covered in snow and soot, bleeding from a graze on his cheek, but he looked like an avenging angel of the wilderness. Gable panicked. He swung his silver revolver wildly toward Wyatt and fired. The shot went wide, snapping a branch above Wyatt's head. Wyatt didn't flinch. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared. Gable staggered backward, dropping his revolver as a blossom of dark blood exploded on his shoulder. He fell into the snow, screaming in agony, clutching his shattered collarbone. Wyatt walked forward, kicking Gable's gun away. He stood over the writhing aristocrat, his eyes devoid of mercy. "You lost, Gable," Wyatt said, his voice like grinding stones. "You take your broken arm, you walk back to Bear Creek, and you tell William Andrews Clark that this ridge belongs to the Caldwells. If you ever set foot on my mountain again, I won't aim for the shoulder." Wyatt turned his back on the groaning man and walked toward the cave. Julia dropped the Winchester into the snow and ran to him. Wyatt dropped his weapon and caught her, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, burying his face in her soot-stained neck. "You're alive," she sobbed, clinging to his broad shoulders as if he might evaporate. "I promised you I'd come back," he whispered, kissing her hair, her forehead, her lips. Lily bolted from the cave, throwing her arms around Wyatt's leg. Wyatt fell to his knees, wrapping them both in a crushing, desperate embrace. The cold mountain wind howled around them, but surrounded by Wyatt's strength, Julia had never felt warmer. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out, leaving nothing but a smoldering, blackened scar against the pristine white snow. Julia, Wyatt, and Lily stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the final wisps of gray smoke drift into the morning sky. The cabin was completely gone. The barn, thankfully, had been spared due to a shift in the wind, providing shelter for the horses and a temporary refuge for the family. "It's all gone," Julia whispered, leaning her head against Wyatt's arm. "Logs and nails," Wyatt replied stoically, though a muscle in his jaw feathered with suppressed grief. "We can cut more logs. We can forge more nails." "But the land deed," Julia said, panic creeping back into her voice. "Josiah Flint's men, the Pinkertons. What if they come? We have no house, no money to fight them in court." Wyatt's eyes narrowed as he looked at the center of the ruins. The wooden floorboards had burned away, revealing the stone foundation. And in the very center, the heavy iron trapdoor of the root cellar remained entirely intact, shielded by the earth. "Not everything burned," Wyatt said. He walked into the ashes, his boots kicking up clouds of soot, and heaved the heavy iron door open. He climbed down into the cellar and emerged a moment later, hauling the heavy, iron-bound trunk Julia had discovered weeks ago in the pantry. He dragged it out of the ashes and set it in the snow before them. "I couldn't read the papers inside," Wyatt confessed, pulling a heavy iron key from his pocket and snapping the brass padlock open. "Mary told me never to open it unless I was taking Lily away from the mountain. She said it was her father's legacy." Julia knelt in the snow and pushed the heavy lid open. Inside, resting beneath a perfectly preserved velvet quilt, was a heavy leather ledger and a stack of crisp, official-looking documents bearing federal seals. Julia carefully lifted the documents, her eyes scanning the elegant cursive. She gasped. "Wyatt," Julia breathed, looking up at him in absolute shock. "Mary's father wasn't just a merchant. These are shares, railroad shares. And this," she pulled out a heavily stamped parchment, "this is a perpetual land grant signed by Ulysses S. Grant himself. It puts this entire ridge, all 3,000 acres, into an irrevocable trust for Lily." Wyatt stared at the papers, uncomprehending. "What does that mean?" "It means Gable can't touch you," Julia laughed, tears of disbelief spilling down her cheeks. "Even if he buys off every local judge in Bear Creek, this is a federal trust. William Andrews Clark doesn't have enough money to break a presidential grant. The land belongs to Lily. Forever." She opened the leather ledger. Tucked inside the front cover was a bank draft drawn from the First National Bank of Philadelphia, payable to the bearer. "And this," Julia said, her voice shaking, "is a draft for $10,000. Mary left you a fortune, Wyatt." She knew the railroad would eventually come. Wyatt fell to his knees in the snow, staring at the trunk. For years, he had broken his back, lived in near poverty, and isolated himself, believing he was protecting his daughter from a world that wanted to crush them. All along, his late wife had left them the keys to a kingdom. Julia reached out, taking his rough, scarred hands in hers. "We have to go to Missoula. We have to take these papers to a federal judge." 3 days later, Wyatt, Julia, and Lily stood in the grand, wood-paneled chambers of us District Judge Hiram Knowles in the bustling city of Missoula. Judge Knowles, a stern man with a magnificent white beard, adjusted his spectacles as he examined the papers. Thomas Gable had been arrested the day prior, discovered bleeding in a Bear Creek saloon, and was currently sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial for attempted murder and land fraud. "These documents are airtight, Mr. Caldwell," Tawdle, Judge Knowles stated, stamping the parchment with a heavy brass seal. "The Anaconda Copper Company has no claim here. Furthermore, Miss Jenkins," the judge looked over the rim of his glasses at Julia, "I have reviewed the affidavit regarding your debts in St. Louis. Josiah Flint's claim is predatory slavery, utterly unenforceable in this territory. I am issuing an injunction. If Mr. Flint or his Pinkerton dogs cross the Montana border, they will be arrested on sight." Julia let out a breath she felt she had been holding since she left Missouri. The invisible chain around her neck finally snapped. She was free. They walked out of the courthouse and onto the bustling, sunlit streets of Missoula. The air smelled of pine, roasting peanuts, and industry. Wyatt stopped on the boardwalk, oblivious to the crowds parting around his massive, buckskin-clad frame. He turned to Julia. He didn't drop to one knee. The mountain man had too much pride for city theatrics, but he took his hat off, holding it against his chest. His piercing blue eyes were impossibly soft, stripped of all the ice that had once guarded his soul. "I placed an ad for a cook," Wyatt said softly, his deep voice carrying only for her. "I spent my last dime hoping for someone to bake bread and keep the fire warm, but the mountain gave me a fighter. It gave Lily a mother." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple, braided band of rose gold. He had purchased it that morning from a jeweler down the street. "I don't want a housekeeper, Julia," Wyatt said, his voice trembling just a fraction. "I want a wife. I want a partner to help me build a new cabin. A bigger one with a porch facing the sunrise. Will you marry me?" Julia's heart soared. She looked down at little Lily, who was beaming up at her, tugging impatiently on Julia's skirt. "Say yes, Mommy," Lily whispered loudly. Julia laughed, a bright, joyous sound that echoed down the street. She looked back up at the giant mountain man who had saved her life, just as she had saved his. "I will marry you, Wyatt Caldwell," Julia said, stepping into his arms. "But I have one condition." Wyatt smiled, a slow, devastatingly handsome smirk that reached his eyes. "Name it. I am never scrubbing a cast-iron skillet with sand ever again." Wyatt threw his head back and laughed, a booming, genuine sound that turned heads on the boardwalk. He slid the ring onto her finger, pulled her flush against his chest, and kissed her right there in the middle of the city, a promise of fire, survival, and a love forged in the unforgiving heart of the Bitterroots. Julia and Wyatt's story proves that sometimes the most desperate leaps of faith lead us exactly where we were always meant to be. From a freezing, isolated cabin to a blazing fight for survival, their love was forged in the fire of the untamed West, bound together by the whisper of a little girl who knew exactly who she needed. Did this rugged mountain romance capture your heart? If you want more thrilling, high-stakes, historical dramas and twists that keep you guessing, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow story lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable tales.